This is Wallace McCutcheon's The Sculptor's Nightmare, released in 1908. The short film follows a drunk sculptor who wakes up to see the faces of the presidential sculptures he's created have become animated, moving around and talking. During this scene, clay is used to form the sculptures and animate their talking heads. While stop-motion animation had been normalized throughout the film industry in the early 1900s, foundational films such as The Sculptor's Nightmare not only inspired future generations of filmmakers in using stop-motion animation, but also a different subgenre of stop-motion, claymation, a term coined by Will Vinton about 70 years after The Sculptor's Nightmare. Claymation sounds like exactly what it is: animation consisting of sets and characters made out of clay. Like any other form of animation, claymation consists of many still images played in rapid succession to simulate movement. While many stop-motion films have used clay due to its malleability and the fact that it's easy to manipulate, not every stop-motion film is considered claymation. How did this genre come to be? By looking at how claymation has developed throughout history, its creative process, as well as its impressive and distinct catalog of media, it's clear that some dedicated artists painstakingly challenged their creative energy into creating the tactile and practical world of claymation. Often called clay or putty, the material that claymation uses is high in plasticity and was originally intended as a sealant or repair material in the late 1800s. As technology developed, as did putty, eventually leading to the creation of plasticine, the standard for claymation due to its structural integrity. Due to patent differences and issues, there is debate as to who first invented plasticine. Franz Cobb is seen as an inventor in Germany with a patent in 1880, and William Harbut developed his patent in England in 1897. Shortly after its invention, it was used as a modeling and sculpting clay, which lent itself well to a developing film industry. One of the first films to really bring clay to life was a 4-minute film by Walter Booth in 1911 called Animated Putty. Although only 4 minutes long, the film combined the developing stop-motion animation technique along with clay to prove the possibilities that existed with clay in filmmaking. Another notable early example of claymation was Willie Hopkins' Miracles in Mud, a segment in the Universal Screen magazine, a weekly collection of films that aired in Canada from 1916 to 1918. While Booth and Hopkins' works were relatively simple in their presentation and ideas, the effects of their work would reverberate for generations between filmmakers and animators looking for the next innovation in their craft. However, one of the most prominent claymation animators has a body of work that will likely never be seen. Helena Smith Dayton is not only a pioneer in claymation, but perhaps one of the first female animators, period. Her work is estimated to have been released in the late 1910s and early 20s, with the first documented film releasing March 25, 1917, in New York City. That same year, she released an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. Unfortunately, all that exists of her work today is one film strip from her film Battle of the Suds. While her work has been lost to time and will unfortunately probably never be seen by a modern audience, her work is certainly in the same realm as Booth's and Hopkins, inspiring a new generation of filmmakers and, more importantly, women. The first claymation narrative film that we still have today is Long Live the Bull, animated by Joseph Sun. The silent film is about a man named Bellona who is trying to win the love of a woman who says she will only love him back if he can successfully fight a bull. There are many references within the film to the fact that the characters are made out of clay, a sense of humor that would help to carry the tradition of claymation. Although it's impossible to know why exactly Sun decided to use clay, it can be assumed that it's mostly due to the fact that clay is easy to model and move and offers a different effect to cell animation, as the characters and sets actually exist in the real world. The possibilities that plasticine offered for creative people were realized not long after his invention, as Sun's film illustrated that not only characters but props and sets could all be modeled out of clay, opening the door for a new form of animation. While these pioneers of putty in the early 1900s would have a great impact later on, it was hard for clay animation to flourish during its painstakingly meticulous process, which was up against the normalized and hugely successful cell animation format. Where in cell animation, a large team of people could be working on different parts of a project at the same time, clay animation was a lot slower, more work, and less efficient. However, as the film and television industry developed and boomed, creators who had been influenced by the short silent films of the 20s will begin to really develop the style and aesthetic of claymation today. In 1947, the children's television show Howdy Doody debuted. Being a pioneer in children's media that many shows would follow, a host, Buffalo Bob, and his puppet sidekick, Howdy Doody, would have a series of stories and adventures with other puppet members of the cast, broken up with segments of various acts, such as music or animation. One of these segments would include characters conceived by a man named Art Clokey and his wife Ruth, and their names were Gumby and Pokey. Art Clokey was an experimental filmmaker who had worked with clay prior to Howdy Doody, notably in his short film Gumbasia. However, Gumby and Pokey became popular recurring characters on Howdy Doody, so much so that after the success of Gumby Goes to the Moon on Howdy Doody, Gumby got his own show in 1955. The Gumby Show was a show in which Gumby and his orange horse sidekick Pokey would have creative and humorous adventures. Gumby was first voiced by Ruth Eggleston, an art director's wife, until 1957 when Dallas McKennon took the role over. Clokey himself offered his voice for Pokey. The show was successful during the 50s and reached syndication in 1959. Gumby had a very distinct character design. Clokey is quoted as saying that his name comes from a muddy clay that his family had on their farm that they called gumbo.
When it would rain, my father would come in and say he got stuck in the gumbo.
His green color was picked to be seen as racially neutral, and also, Clokey liked the color. Part of the reason for Gumby's popularity was the fact that clay animation was not in the mainstream at this point. The distinct design mixed with Clokey's creative and imaginative animation made the franchise a success, as the Gumby Show continued to air throughout the 60s as well, ending its initial run in 1968. Clokey also invented the popular Christian claymation show Davy and Goliath in 1961, which ran for 5 seasons, and a special episode in 2004. However, Gumby would go on to have a wider appeal. The success of Gumby would cement Art Clokey as one of the forefathers of claymation. While other claymation projects did exist at the time, Clokey's Gumby franchise dominated the genre from the 50s to the early 70s. Although the story of Gumby does not end here in the 70s, the effect that Clokey and those that came before him had on claymation would really begin to be felt during this time, as the term claymation was about to be coined in the coming decade, and new developments in technology, along with techniques in animation, would cement claymation as its own genre of stop-motion animation. In 1975, an 8-minute short film called Close Mondays won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film. This film differed from every other winner who had come before it in this category. It was made almost entirely of clay. The short follows a drunk man who stumbles into an art gallery and interacts with the various pieces of art, similar to The Sculptor's Nightmare. The man eventually becomes one of the statues at the gallery in the end. The film featured models and characters that were a lot more intricate and detailed than claymation projects of the past, such as Clokey's. It also blended clay and new techniques that had rarely been used before in claymation. It was clear that this short was taking the genre to a new creative high. The short was produced by Bob Gardner and Will Vinton. Will Vinton's breakout short film will be the first of many innovations to be made in the claymation genre. In 1976, he and Gardner would collaborate again for the short film Mountain Music, which brought the genre of claymation to life with a more expansive set, music, and blending in some practical effects. This short would cement Will Vinton's distinct style of claymation, which would define a huge chunk of his career. 2 years later, Vinton would animate the ambitious 40-minute Rip Van Winkle, an adaptation of the folktale, which would be nominated for an Academy Award as well. Despite the film once again furthering the genre of claymation, a very important title would appear in the film that would establish the entire genre. With Will Vinton determined to illustrate the immense work that went into claymation, he also filmed a documentary during the making of Rip Van Winkle, entitled Claymation. The film gave a behind-the-scenes view at the sets that were made and the laborious process of moving each piece to create a clay animated film. Vinton would continue to develop the genre of claymation well into the 80s, adapting other popular stories and receiving multiple Academy Award nominations. Although the technique called clay painting had been used in many of his films, perhaps the 1981 Academy Award nominee Creation, narrated by James Earl Jones, would illustrate Vinton's prowess for not just detailed characters and sets, but paintings made out of clay. It's important to note here the work of claymation animator Joan Gratz, who started her career as an animator on Rip Van Winkle. Gratz worked with Vinton and helped him in furthering the clay painting technique.
Joan was in and out of the Vinton studio. They would bring her in for the clay painting projects. Of course, she had helped establish the Vinton studio.
Yeah.
So
this clay painting technique would win her an Oscar in 1992 for her short Mona Lisa Descending a Staircase, where she recreated and transformed classic pieces of art, blending them with her own style. Joan Gratz is another one of the women whose work may not be properly recognized, but whose impact is undeniable. 1985 would prove to be a very important year for Vinton and for Claymation as a whole. Besides the music video for John Fogerty, Claymation would also play a prominent role in multiple feature films which have a cult status today, frankly, for how disturbing they are.
Like on one of the greatest projects that the Vinton studio worked on before I got there, it was called Return to Oz.
The first of which would be Disney's Return to Oz, which I talked about in a previous video.
The Vinton studio did all of the Gnome King cliff face, where it ends up like kind of crumbling.
The claymation was impressive, and while the film was a flop, has been revered for these impressive animation effects. The second major project would be Vinton's own feature film, The Adventures of Mark Twain. While the film is known today for its dark and creepy segments, particularly one involving the kids in the film meeting Satan, it is a landmark for Vinton's technique with highly detailed faces and impressive animation. Vinton's clear vision and style will lead to a series of prosperous collaborations and ventures throughout the rest of the 80s and into the 90s. After working on Return to Oz, Disney would hire Vinton to work on their film Captain EO, the Francis Ford Coppola directed, George Lucas produced sci-fi film starring Michael Jackson that aired in Epcot during the 80s. This strange film would begin a partnership between Jackson and Vinton, who would go on to animate the Speed Demon section of the Moonwalker movie, as well as feature Jackson in Vinton's new prominent business, television commercials.
California raisins from the California vineyards.
Don't you know I heard it through the grapevine?
Sounds great, doesn't it?
In 1988, Vinton Studios will begin producing the immensely popular California Raisins commercials, which will go on to feature Michael Jackson, as well as the Domino's Noid character. These partnerships existed into the 90s, and Will Vinton Studios began to produce seasonal claymation specials and television products. By the time the 90s had rolled around, it was clear that claymation had entered the media's consciousness, and because of the dedication of the people in Vinton's studio and Vinton's creative vision, this would open the floodgates for claymation as a whole. During the 90s, Vinton would become very interested in the bustling developments in CGI animations, and go on to expand in that medium, such as with the M&M characters. His story, nor did the story of claymation end there, as claymation was once again going to see a resurgence and development into a new millennium. While Will Vinton's claymation projects would continue into the late 90s, another company that started around the same time as Vinton's would develop their style and brand during the following decades as well. In 1972, Peter Lord and David Sproxton founded Aardman Animators Limited. The British company began producing small segments for a TV show called Take Heart, much like how Gumby first got his start. A few years later, in 1980, Morph would get his own show as well, and would continue to be featured in the shows of Tony Hart. In 1985, animator Nick Park would join the Aardman team, and his input and creative spirit would be invaluable to the company. However, what would really cement Aardman as the go-to claymation studio in Europe will be their work on the music video for Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer in 1986, which won a multitude of awards for its clay and stop-motion animation. The company would end the decade with some productions that would prove to be very significant for them. The first of these would be 1989 and 1990's Creature Comforts, a mockumentary-style claymation television show and film that aired in Britain. Created by Park, the show would wind up being a huge hit. The short would continue in the footsteps of Will Vinton, winning the Academy Award for Best Animated Short of 1991. The short would beat out other nominees, one of them being Nick Park's other successful claymation film in 1990, A Grand Day Out. A Grand Day Out introduced the characters of Wallace and Gromit, who would end up being the unofficial mascots of the company. The characters would spawn their own franchise, including another short film, The Wrong Trousers, in 1993, which would win Park another Oscar. What Aardman was bringing to the table that was different from other claymation studios of the time was developing characters and narratives. While the design, personalities, and stories of Wallace and Gromit were quite simple, especially in these earlier shorts, these were clear stories, less like Vinton's early work, and more like his feature film. However, the simple and soft design carried a much different tone than intricate details of Vinton's later clay animation work, and by cementing themselves as a company that can make a defined character and an easy-to-follow narrative, Aardman filled a gap in the claymation genre that would continue to build throughout the 90s, making history in the year 2000 with their first feature film.
Ever wonder what chickens do when you're not looking?
Chicken Run was Aardman's first feature film, and although Will Vinton's The Adventures of Mark Twain came before it, that film had a limited theatrical release and was more of an anthology film. Chicken Run was a narrative with original characters and a story, and when it was released, became the highest grossing stop-motion film in history up to that point, being released in partnership with DreamWorks. The film was known for its style and humor, following a flock of chickens who plan to escape their prison-like coop to try to avoid being turned into meat pies. For this film, Aardman used their unique animation style along with the narrative elements they had developed during the previous decade to release a film that, while not the first of its kind, certainly broke boundaries and brought Claymation to a worldwide audience. This would begin the successful franchise of Aardman and their animated feature films. Aardman would continue to create claymation films into 2000s, debuting Wallace and Gromit on the big screen with The Curse of the Were-Rabbit in 2005. It's no doubt that these recognizable characters helped the film's success, with multiple TV series featuring Wallace and Gromit in the early 2000s. The film would become a critical and commercial success, winning more than 25 awards, including an Oscar for Best Animated Film. It is without question that Aardman Studios dominated the claymation genre in the 90s and early 2000s, creating not only critically acclaimed movies, but also multiple franchises such as Wallace and Gromit and the Shaun the Sheep series. Claymation would prove to be a successful and worthwhile medium, despite the grueling and slow animation process. Perhaps the tactile element of the films brought the audience closer to the characters and stories, feeling less separated from the putty than the popular CGI films of the time. However, while these three companies would be the pillars of claymation in the 70s through to 2000s, the 80s would end up being a time of growth for the genre, while the 90s and 2000s would lead to some immense changes for the genre as well. The growth of the claymation genre came in the form of different countries besides America and Great Britain embracing the medium to create some noteworthy films. In 1981, Alexander Tatarsky created Plasticine Crow, Russia's first claymation film. This would go on to inspire other Russian creators, such as Gary Barden, who released his claymation Break in 1985, winning him a Golden Dove Award. One of the more notable works to come out around this time would be Switzerland's animated children's show Pingu, known for its cartoonish sound effects and silly animation style. The show was created by Ottmar Gutmann from Germany. The show ran for 10 years and was revised in 2003 in the United Kingdom. These are just a few notable examples of claymation taking shape in other countries, but while claymation was flourishing on a worldwide scale, things were changing within the industry back in the United States. The late 80s and early 90s saw the resurgence of the somewhat forgotten Gumby franchise. Eddie Murphy began to parody the character on SNL, and later in the 80s, Gumby got his first home video release. Gumby would make an appearance in the Puppetoon movie in 1988. These features began to grow the interest of Gumby in pop culture again, and in 1988, the series Gumby Adventures brought 99 shorts with it, some being old shorts with re-recorded audio and new music. The Gumby revival led Clokey to independently produce a feature-length Gumby film, Gumby the Movie. The film finished production in 1992, but did not see theaters until 1995, struggling to find a distributor. Due to this, the film had a very small theatrical release, making under $60,000 back of its $2.8 million budget. This was the last major project that Clokey ever made with Gumby. Clokey unfortunately passed away in 2010, but luckily, due to much of the content being available on YouTube and streaming service Tubi, his and Gumby's legacy lives on. Perhaps the failure of Gumby the Movie would act as a bad omen, as Will Vinton Studios was about to undergo a massive change as well.
There were extraordinarily strange happenings and amazing manipulation.
In the late 90s and early 2000s, Will Vinton Studios were still working on claymation projects, focusing on adult animation projects such as the PJs and Gary and Mike. While both gained a cult fan base, neither show lasted very long, and by 2002, things were not looking good. Investor Phil Knight, founder of Nike, eventually became the majority shareholder of the struggling company, and Vinton was ousted from his own company. After an unsuccessful lawsuit, Vinton went on to found a new company, Will Vinton's Free Will Entertainment. This company did not reach the same success. Only a year later, Vinton would be diagnosed with multiple myeloma and officially retire from producing films in 2008. While this was another case of a career being dampened, much of Vinton's catalog has gone on to be archived and still widely appreciated. In 2021, director Mark Evans released a documentary, Clay Dream, chronicling the life and legacy of Vinton. If you want to know more details specifically about Will Vinton's life and the struggles with the company, I would suggest checking that out. Once Vinton was kicked out of his company, the company rebranded to Laika Studios in 2005, and with the addition of prominent stop-motion animator Henry Selick, who worked on films such as The Nightmare Before Christmas and James and the Giant Peach, the company continued to tread in Vinton's footsteps, creating very successful and notable stop-motion works that utilize some clay and carry the same ideals. Movies like Coraline, which became the first 3D stop-motion film, Paranorman, and most recently, Wendell Wild. While Vinton's story is ultimately tragic, these films continue to develop and change the way that claymation is used in the modern day, which pays respect to Vinton and the genre that he ultimately created. Aardman continued to embrace the ideals of claymation, releasing a series of commercial and critical successes. However, their story is not without its tragedies as well. In 2005, a giant fire happened, destroying 30 years worth of props and sets. While a lot was destroyed, this wouldn't stop Aardman. On the big screen, films such as The Pirates in 2012 continued to cement Aardman's ever-growing catalog of beloved films, and with the more recent successes of the Shaun the Sheep franchise and some other newer releases, even a planned sequel to Chicken Run, Aardman continued to stick with their roots into 2000s and does so today. Aardman, along with Laika, continue to carry the torch of claymation. Looking outside of the three major claymation companies, the medium was embraced by a variety of creators during the 2000s. Perhaps out of nostalgia, or with a generation of creators who grew up with claymation, the medium was used in a lot of adult animation. Creators like Eric Fogel in his projects such as Celebrity Deathmatch or Glenn Martin DDS, which used elements of claymation, went on to help define adult animation at the time. Perhaps the most notable example of this would be Dino Stamatopoulos' Moral Oral in 2005, which heavily parodied Clokey's Davy and Goliath and its Christian themes. Although on the surface the show was just an obvious satire, using shock humor in the claymation style, the show has a strong cult following, and has recently been renowned for its dark themes and character development, turning into a tragic drama as well. As claymation found a wider adult audience, this happened on the big screen as well, as many new films broke new ground in claymation. Claymation was certainly headed in new and interesting places in the 2000s, and one of these places would be a new medium. The 90s also saw the rise of claymation in video games, with one of the first of these being the clay-themed games by Interplay Productions in 1993, Clay Fighter and Claymates for the SNES. The games feature claymation-style graphics that were created by photographing and digitizing clay models. Clay Fighter received multiple sequels, including one on the Nintendo 64, in which the claymation style is much more noticeable. While the claymation aesthetic is most certainly clear in these games, the first game to really embrace the medium was The Neverhood in 1996, a point-and-click adventure game released for PC and PlayStation, entirely comprised of clay models and sets. Being able to control these clay models added to the tactile element of claymation that films could not reach. PC gaming would continue to embrace the medium, with impressive games such as Mythos games, Magic and Mayhem, a strategy game in which monster models were all made of claymation, and Platypus in 2002 by Squashy Games, a horizontal shooter. Claymation video games existed in a variety of genres of game, and these games are proof of how claymation continued to change and be embraced in new ways during the 90s and 2000s. While big-budget movies, television shows, and video games were pushing claymation to new heights, claymation found a natural home amongst independent and amateur filmmakers as well. Something we've yet to discuss is how clay was easily accessible and relatively cheap, and with products like Play-Doh that brought clay into the hands of children as a creative outlet, clay had had a universal appeal and history of creativity. With the invention of the internet and popularity of sites like YouTube and Newgrounds, hundreds of thousands of people appeared experimenting with claymation. Many amateur claymation artists found a platform for their work, and some managed to create series and films, garnering small but tightly knit fan bases. One of the most prominent examples of this would be Robert Benford's Clay World. Benfer, better known as Knox on the internet, created Knox's Corner, his own website, and a series of silly but imaginative claymation videos called Clay World. Benfer created all of these in his bedroom and eventually dropped out of high school to dedicate himself to his animations. In 2005, he independently filmed, produced, and released a feature-length film, Clay World Off the Table, which his dedicated fanbase paid to see, generating over $100,000 for Benfer. Benfer eventually retired the series in 2013 with a short film entitled Clay World All Gone. Examples such as this prove the inclusive and DIY aspect of claymation that is part of what led to its popularity in the first place, and is part of the reason why the spirit of claymation still exists today. What do you think claymation offers that other mediums don't?
The combination of the artist bringing their sculptural style, the artist animating, the real-time lighting, real objects getting real light, the texture, and the accident, make it better than the alternative in CG. Every bit of it is informed by the artist. Almost every bit of it is touched by his hand.
As mentioned, Studios like Laika and Aardman Animators have carried on the claymation tradition in the 2010s and 2020s. However, claymation has been ingrained into pop culture consciousness, but also continued to be on the independent sphere on YouTube and elsewhere, with creators like Lee Hardcastle, Goldies, and Claim. While we have only scratched the surface of what claymation has to offer across the world, I believe that one theme runs across all the claymation projects examined here today, and that is the foundational element of claymation at its core: passion. This is not to say that any creative project or animation doesn't take passion, but it takes a special type of passion and dedication to create claymation on a professional or even amateur scale. Claymation is knowing that it will take double or triple the amount of work as a standard CGI or even hand-drawn animated film, but doing it anyway. Claymation is molding characters, sets, and props by hand, seeing the fingerprints and imperfections in every frame. Claymation is converting the tactile experience to rolling clay around in your hands to a beautiful art form that anyone can relate to in aesthetic alone. By comparing where claymation is today to where its roots are, so much in the medium has changed. However, the fundamental element of passion has stayed the same, before the term claymation was coined and well after. This leaves us in an interesting place in the overall history of claymation. In what ways will technology and innovation push the medium of claymation even further? And which creators will break the mold and withhold the ancient art of playing with putty? While we cannot know this, it's interesting to think that because claymation is so accessible, it could be anyone. All it takes is dedication, heart, and above all, passion. Thanks for listening. Take it easy.
Short list of great clay animators. Of course, you've got the work of Joan Gratz, and then you've got the work of Bruce Bickford, Anthony Lucas, and he did a great film that was nominated for the Oscar called Slim Pickings. Oh, Tim Watts and David Stoughton. Tim Hiddle. You've got Rich Zimmerman,